Hello all, and now I want to start discussion videos on Wittgenstein's later work, of course with the philosophical investigations. I did the Tractatus about a month ago now, and so now I wanted to look at some of his own critiques of structured logical language and how that isn't possible, as well as some of his solutions that I didn't really brush up on too much in his last video. And so, if we were going to really hone in on, his language theory in critique with regards to philosophers prior to him, he really focuses in on the Augustinian view of language in its usage for sign correlation within language. So, of course, we would think of the sign and the word and how it's signified together. And so, of course, Wittgenstein has many problems with this. For Wittgenstein, language isn't a sign reference correlation, but how we actually use our language. And so one of the examples that he uses to demonstrate this is a shopkeeper being asked for 5 apples. But what is actually the number 5 on its own in the counting process in meaning? In other words, you can't really pull 5 in a sort of theoretical, philosophical way, even outside of the context of the use of 5 in the example of the 5 apples. You couldn't just, show someone new to a language, 5 apples just in a row and expect them to, grasp that there is an actual pointing process or a counting process embedded within, the shopkeeper having 5 apples. And so this is, of course, a famous example that he points to. Another famous example that is very interesting and I think demonstrates what his critiques really are of prior language theory before him is the builder example. And the builder example is something that it's a sort of theme within the investigations that matures into so far how Wittgenstein demonstrates that it's rather nonsensical in that sort of sense, where you have this sort of concrete organization through the example of building this sort of primitive language of sign and reference between the builders saying, rock or slab, whatever the case may be, or a sort of quantity of color within it. But within, that process, you can't really point directly towards, pointing in and of itself, as demonstrated with the apples. The process is within, the words and the context and how they're actually used. Language is use, of course. And, there or that, or, place this rock there. That has to be used within the process of the builders and not simply just learned, off to the side somewhere as its own sort of abstract concept. And so what he's really referring to here is that there's actually language games, but there isn't an actual essence or, a sort of, game theory, if you will, within, well, it is within our language games, but we can't actually, pull a sort of essence or demonstrate a sort of theoretical way of, catching it off as its own separate entity without, having this sort of being within a language game itself. And so he's, departing away from the Tractatus in a large way here with this sort of pluralized, decentralized view of language, as compared to, trying to build a sort of hierarchy of a state of affairs within the Tractatus. And so teaching language is a training of using the words, but not, the language itself. You're not just simply learning something like, again, there or that. You're using it within its context with the other words. And so words, a part of the language game, such as the example of something like Ring Around the Rosie, the words are a part of the use of the game. And so as the builder example matures, the more it reduces down to this absurdity of, well, you can't really have a sort of primitive language and stand on the outside looking in unless you're actually, within that process itself. And so, again, we ask, what is the pointing process of language of that thing? How does pointing actually work within language in an actual way of the use of the words itself, and not as an actual concrete example? And so many philosophers prior, of course, was tempted to refer to language out of a simplistic, universal theory of language when uses themselves make language complexify out from the using process. Words can have a sign correlation, of course, but there are many other words that modify inostensibly, such as that, and, or, there. And so these words, modify the other words around them, and provide navigation to what the builders are actually trying to build. And so in his other famous example, which I hope to do a separate video on, a little footnotes video, if you will, that I'll try to use Wittgenstein's philosophy towards the scene, is language as a city. And so language is never complete, another sort of critique of philosophy prior to him. Language is never complete, and there's different games that evolve and grow within, different beings or different times and different periods. Life itself is always embedded within the use of language for its contextualization. Such as an analogy, we would never understand, what someone who could even use our own, human language, for example, with animals, such as a lion, he wouldn't be able to actually understand the humanity of our language and, provide that sort of contextualization. So, in other words, he says perhaps animals can think, but we couldn't actually comprehend because we are within our own human language games. And so that's always an interesting thing that I took away from with Wittgenstein's philosophy is, even if you had someone who, had a sort of a way of communicating by, definitions or something like that, we still wouldn't be able to truly understand them because of our context as beings. But continuing on with, how does naming actually work? And so the word number depends on the recognition of its use being similar in how it's taught. And so, to switch back to Augustine, his critique is really the presupposition that Augustine uses of language always filling the void, such as, a foreigner, if you will, learning a language as if they presupposed a different one. And so, where there could be a gap, if you will, there's this presupposition that, this was always known or could be known, and Wittgenstein takes issue with that. Because, of course, philosophy creates these structured symbols within language. When an object and word cannot relate, though, at the differences between classic arguments such as mind, body, and soul, then you haven't really actually named or even have sort of meaning anymore, because they have different meanings that have strayed away from the words themselves. And so for Wittgenstein, that naming with the word "this" might actually be the only real way to name. Because if meaning is correspondent, then this is a false use of language, for it is only true within a state of affairs. The meaning of the word is within its use in language. And so, like his own earlier work, and with the likes of Russell and Plato, we presuppose correspondence where the unit of analysis correlates. And so this sort of view that there's a system or a homogeneous way of meaning across all times and place is the view that Wittgenstein ultimately rejects within the investigations, because the simple idea within logical atomism with regards to his early work and Russell's work presupposes a language game that simple and compound ideas or objects can be construed as. But moving on now to other questions, such as what rules govern language games. And so there's no fit-all size, if you will, for these rules. But only in a recognition of a mistake made by others. And if you observed someone's misuse of language within those changing rules within a language context, and so this mistakes, if you will, and he links this to behavior as a sort of doorway into the embedded wrongness within someone's potential language misuse under the context of rules. And it's pretty classic if you're looking at Wittgenstein's philosophy with regards to something like a ball. A ball in has several different meanings and rules within different team sports, and even how the ball will appear as an object is different within those rules with basketball, football, whatever the case may be. And so there's no use of the Platonic reality of an underlying language forms in their ideal, and disregard. And so to Wittgenstein, you're disregarding the soil within the use that language actually comes from. And so one of the interesting dichotomies is the exact and inexact dichotomy of meaning, dependent on the use, but not on a logically pure idea, such as what time is it? Obviously, if I told you the time right now, It's going to not be down to a precise moment in time, but it has a sort of pointing, if you will, towards a rather accurate. So there's no real pure idea or pure solution there. And so the essence of language then, in its familiarity of its use, and philosophy such as the Platonic forms of looking for essences or attempting a sort of logic or empiricism, and this deters away from the ordinary use that Wittgenstein is trying to espouse here. And of course this is leading to the likes of A.J. Ayer and ordinary language, everyday use language within philosophy. And so in order to understand the logic of a word, you must understand the language game, of course, and its context. And so for Wittgenstein, the investigations of logic is in its grammar of concrete use of it, instead of the incomplete view of language, where language is just incompleted, and Frege, for example, holds that view. And so Wittgenstein's saying, no, it's actually within the grammatical system in their examples for a word and its logic. And so he has critiques of the Platonic essences, which always manage to never be in this sort of plain, ordinary language site. And so Wittgenstein wants us to ask not, what is a proposition, what is the essence of justice, but instead he wants to look how these examples are, how they are actually demonstrated, rather than a sort of intellectual form of analysis that's, again, sort of abstracted off to the side somewhere, away from contextualization. And so this takes aim at classic philosophy and its concerns for essential definitions, such as language, thought, world, meaning, existence. The language applied is actually missing. And so there's no language game to make sense of then you really don't have any actual meaning in these propositions. And so words like justice, for Wittgenstein, should be humbled and rooted in actual form of use, instead of this alienated Platonic form where these examples they have these sort of essence within them, but its truest form, its truest essence isn't accessible. And so this leads to what he believes philosophy should really be, as a sort of therapy. And so he wants to do away with these theoretical, philosophical explanations, and instead definitions, if you will, look for description as method. And this is, of course, is going to be hugely influential for philosophy going forward, where you see questions like how rather than what. And so there's a quote that Wittgenstein has where philosophy is a battle of bewitchment of our intelligence through language, with the true goal of philosophy being a sort of clarity of thought, whereas metaphysics and trying to find the dynamics of what makes our reality this isn't sufficient because there's many different philosophical methods one can use, of course, within a language game. And so he's offering up these different forms of therapy, of finding logic within its actual usage. And this is how he sees where many of these philosophical problems go away, because they're more or less embedded to a definition of theory that doesn't actually exist often to its own, but it's in its actual domain themselves. And so this really is a summary of Wittgenstein's later philosophy and various critiques of other language theorists and thinkers. And so I hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you for the next one.